because if you have, in the case of Yugoslavia or Sudan, or also with the oil companies, and I've heard this firsthand in Nigeria, if you have a situation where two parties are at conflict, it becomes very easy to then justify the military intervention. It's no longer humanitarian. Now we actually have to send military forces in to stop the fighting as an ostensible precursor to getting the humanitarian aid in. And it is a sort of Walmart model. You can just apply it to all of these countries. And I saw it very much firsthand in a country that I think in our lifetime is going to go down at the hands of the United States, and that is Africa's most powerful country, Nigeria, which has incredible oil resources. It's the most populous nation in Africa, and it really is a place that we should be paying some attention to. And there's been an incredible resistance that has been building there for many, many decades. But because it's happening in Africa, it ain't happening. You know, it's happening in a strong, what should be a strong nation, is made a weak, corrupt nation by U.S. corporate policy. And the oil companies in the south of Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, fan the flames of ethnic tension and crisis and infighting. And you go there, which I actually have done, and you travel around, and it's relatively non-existent. There is fighting among people the same way that there's gang fighting in the United States. You know, it's not like happening everywhere in the world. It's, you know, there are fights here and there. Wars happen, conflicts happen. But the U.S. oil companies, it fits in with their agenda to explode, to exacerbate, to justify bringing in private security, to justify paying official military forces to come in. And in all of these cases, these humanitarian interventions, that has been a necessary component of the agenda, is to convince people that a military solution is necessary in order to bring in humanitarian aid. Many of these that I have something to say on as I can. I have sort of scattered notes here. The first thing I think that gets a little bit to the question that you asked about Kosovo, but also in general about some of these so-called humanitarian interventions, is that the U.S. really isn't, and I don't mean to sound any way other than the way I'm going to sound here in saying this, the U.S. is not in the business of nation building. And actually, I mean, it's worth, I think, stopping and thinking about that for a second, because in the case of Kosovo, you have a government in place which is thoroughly anti-democratic, which is as intolerant of ethnic minorities as a government could be, could potentially be the source of great blowback for the United States. And I think it's a matter of time before we have blowback from what the United States did in Bosnia. There's this phenomenon, and it's actually a racist term, but it's the term that's being used, white Al-Qaeda. Because you've got a very heavy Wahhabi influence in Bosnia, and you have a small minority, but not insignificant minority of people in Bosnia who really are in sync with the sort of Islamic militant agenda. And those people could very easily integrate into European capitals. And I think that there's a real potential for legitimate blowback from the U.S. support for these forces within Bosnia. It's a little bit of an insider discussion, whatever, but it is something to look at. But I think it dramatizes a point, and that is that the United States doesn't necessarily think 10 or 20 years down the line in terms of the houses of cards that they're building in a particular country. They think, how can we protect this very limited U.S. agenda and build some semblance of an acceptable force, or one, in the case of Saddam Hussein, that is brutal enough to ensure that our interests are going to be met in this country for at least a decade, or at least for the immediate future. And so in the case of Kosovo, I think that the Clinton administration had a much deeper agenda than the Bush administration. It's complicated. Madeleine Albright was obsessed with Yugoslavia. And they had this vision of smashing Tito's Yugoslavia. And Albright picked up, which was a total fabrication. Milosevic was largely a neoliberal. But they had this fascination, obsession with Milosevic as sort of Tito after Tito. And so there was this much deeper personal agenda in the Clinton years about Yugoslavia. I think it also came at a time when there was a great war that continues over the natural gas and oil in the Caspian Sea. Yugoslavia, and particularly Kosovo, would have played a key role in transporting the resources from Baku into markets in Western Europe. The point of the Caspian Sea was never to come to the United States. It was for Western markets. But also, I think that the Clinton administration was very interested in making its mark internationally. And Clinton, I think, wanted to emerge as a sort of brilliant foreign policy president. And NATO, whoever raised the question about NATO's relevance, it sparked a memory of the whole thing. That was a huge part of it, is that NATO was being declared irrelevant, that the United Nations was becoming increasingly rambunctious and decreasingly supportive of U.S. Violent adventurism. And so Clinton was looking for another international legitimacy stamp, and he got that in NATO. And it wasn't so complicated. I mean, it was not a popular move in Europe to attack Yugoslavia. But what the Clinton administration did is they worked with Germany, they worked with Great Britain, they worked with France, and they sort of started to carve out the pieces of the neoliberal pie in Yugoslavia. George Soros was deeply involved with it. Lots of banks got involved with it. And so now what you see is the sort of democratic imperialism, Democratic Party imperialism that has really taken hold. That's a huge part of Clinton's legacy, was the destruction of Yugoslavia, the destruction of this sort of bizarre remnant of the Cold War, this weird mixed economy, and a total and complete neoliberal takeover. And so I think that when Bush took power in 2000, a lot of Serbian friends breathed a sigh of relief. They're like, "Oh, great, Iraq's going to get attacked." Seriously, it's that kind of people were saying, "Okay, Bush can't find us on a map. Couldn't care less about Kosovo, about Serbia." And largely, the U.S. has handed off the diplomacy, the discussions on independence of Kosovo to the European Union, to Javier Solana, who also was one of the people that led the bombing of Yugoslavia in his role in the European Union and NATO. And so the United States basically just said to Europe, make something happen there. As long as we can keep our military base and we can ensure that U.S. corporations like Halliburton can continue to service the reconstruction in Kosovo, we're okay with whatever you guys work out. And I literally think it's that sort of informal of a thing. Bush has not sent any of his top diplomats to deal with Kosovo. Clinton had Jamie Rubin on the ground in minutes to deal with it, to make sure that their guys were in power, were in place. And so I think that it really goes to the point about nation building and lack thereof. The U.S. isn't really interested in building up a stable, safe, secure environment for anything other than its own interests. And in the case of Kosovo, it has to do with natural resources and strategic importance. Outside of that, there's little relevant to the Bush White House as it was to the Clinton White House when there was a more personalized agenda. But the other thing I think that we're seeing internationally is a really whole-on embrace of Milton Friedman's vision of neoliberalism. You know, the neoconservatism, neoliberalism, they are the same thing. I mean, we've been hoodwinked into believing that there are neoconservatives and neoliberals. Paul Wolfowitz is a neoliberal. They believe in the total and complete dismantling of the institutions of a nation state that are tasked with providing for people. They are the most fundamentalist individuals in the world.